but we'll just go from here. Okay, so this week I thought we'll spend some time on how do we prepare for the demo or game competition. So some people may want to do a demo, other people may want to do a game. I figure I'd put the option in there. So anyways, there's some important details about what's going to happen when, and then we're going to talk about some different game elements and designing a game engine. So the date of the final, it's next week, 8 o'clock in the morning, so it's early. And we'll be doing our final presentations, the game competition, and then the final will be due before class. I mean, technically, I guess due by 10 o'clock in the morning, but I was hoping to review the answers for the final. That way everybody knows what they are and go on. So the final papers are due on Sunday, and then this Thursday we'll do a final review. So I'll go over all the topics and officially say, here's the final. So that's what we'll do. Okay, and so let's go ahead and start with the first thing was game elements. And so we had talked a few weeks ago about state machines and how you can use those to kind of coordinate what happens inside the game. And you already know this, but the game loop, the game loop is kind of an interesting animal in terms of we in some cases we like things to be event driven, and then in other cases we have to poll for state. And so there's always this mixture of, do I poll? Do I just handle discrete events? And then there's the case of it's like holding a hot potato. You have to do something with this before you hand it off to the next. So you can't actually have time to take the potato, take a look at it, decide, especially like AI or any number of things. If you have some kind of algorithm you're normally used to running sequentially, you have to think, how do I make this so it can be done parallel? Because the game loop is basically running, hopefully 60 times a second or more. And there are just some things you have to wrap your mind around that in terms of okay, I have to be able to look at this thing, do something to it, save it for later, and then pick up where you left off before. So in a sense, you're always trying to find ways of handling, for example, it would be easy to handle a keyboard, a piece of input received if you knew just what time it happened, and then you know what to do. So you can say, okay, I'm gonna move a character across the screen. So I have the event says when the key got pressed down and when it got let go. So then I can just use my regular physics formulas and say, okay, this was the velocity and acceleration, and here's the x that you're supposed to be at. But what ends up happening is that you have to basically say, okay, is the key being held down? And if it is being held down, then you have to start integrating some of those physics steps. Okay, let's find out how much he moved in this little time step. And then next time around, then we'll check to see if the keyboard was let go or still pressed. And then there's all sorts of things that can go wrong, like you move your mouse out of the window, or you switch windows, and you're technically you'd never get an off message, so this is, I guess, really prevalent with the mouse. But if you're dragging in a window, you're trying to move something around, and then you switch windows, that doesn't mean you're going to get a mouse off message. And then your window, if your game loop is not properly handling the fact that the window is not active anymore, then maybe the character is just spinning, which is not, that would look strange. I mean, I guess you could tell that if you're playing a multiplayer game and somebody just starts going in circles and you're like, oh, they're away from there.
Suddenly you're in a different window and doing a bunch of mouse clicks.
Right.
Then, suddenly you get back to the game and then you, I don't know, gone through the pause menu and then like done some random stuff.
Right. And yeah, you can mess the game state up very easily. The other thing I find is that you try to do too much into your game state, and because it's all single threaded, some of that's just the design of how the program works. But then what happens is that you stall your rendering loop and everything, or your rendering just takes too long, and so then the next time you decide to update your game loop, you have these time steps that are different sizes, and so then you're struggling to make sure the game is not being like the integration's going out of control, or which could cause some, or you miss a collision that would normally have been caught. So you have to kind of build in these extra steps for handling whether the rules that you set in place for the game are still working. Okay. Some games aren't really prone to this. What kind of game? Maybe what kinds of games are good examples of that don't have this polling issue?
I imagine, like, say a game on a console, maybe.
I think they're less prone to it. I mean, you have more control over whether it happens or not. But there's another type of game where the polling isn't actually an issue anymore. I mean, you have to poll and all that, but it doesn't affect the rules of the game.
Probably.
Maybe something like turn-based games, where you receive the input and then you can execute the whole turn, and you got these discrete elements. So that's an example of a game that you might be polling or handling events in the sense that you just got to keep track of things. But as far as how the game progresses, it's all based on fixed time steps that happen when you've met some particular criteria. Like the person has moved, so the turn is ended. Let's go ahead and simulate everything else in the world and update it. I remember I was watching a post-mortem about Diablo, and when they were making that game in the 90s, and originally it was just going to be like a traditional roguelike game where it's turn-based. So one of the developers was working on it, and he decided that he would just try. They don't want to get necessarily stuck in just having like one turn, right? Just kind of indefinitely. They're hoping maybe to add a little bit more interaction to it. So I think he had it set for every few seconds a turn would happen, but then he tweaked it so that it was like 10 turns a second, and I guess the monster that was inside the thing like basically walked across the room, turned inside another room and like killed the character or something, and he was just kind of like, whoa. What just happened? That was so that's kind of where it turned from basically being a turn-based game to like a real-time one, but just because he increased the clock time, and then it just kind of took a life of its own. And that's kind of those are kind of things that happen when you are kind of deciding how you're going to set the rules of the game up. Okay, and so you have the game loop, and you're polling for state things like, okay, is the joystick down? Is it up? And then you're handling events. So these are things that the window manager will just store up for you in between while you're doing your main processing. You can just kind of catch up on, did the mouse go over the window? Did it leave the window? Did the mouse go down? Did it go up? Did the keyboard get pressed? Did it go up? So these are things that you can handle. And then the next part is then, how do you represent game state? So we spent some time talking about the finite state machines, push-down automata, ways of keeping track of what the main game mode is. But there's all different kinds of things of state that you have to keep track of. So, for example, main menu, you're keeping track of, okay, what are all my settings? Am I playing an animation in the background? What kind of music is playing? Is it still playing? Do I need to restart it? Do I need to play a sound effect because mouse got moved over a button or it got pressed, and so on. So, okay, so the main menu has its own set of state you got to keep track of. And then you might be in like level 1 or level 2, like whatever the mode of the game is, right? So some games are kind of sequential in terms of, they have a specific story that they're trying to tell, and then you move on to the next part and the next part. Maybe it's like an arcade where you have like waves of enemies, and so you're keeping track of like the wave number. And then while you're in those, you might have additional state you're keeping track of, like, was the player blown up or not? So do we need to transition to reducing a life from the, lives counter, and then check to see if the game is over or not, or if we need to switch to a different mode to ask whether we should continue or just show a game over screen. Okay, so you might be keeping track of state to kind of determine that. Or maybe you're doing an adventure game or an RPG, and your ability to move on to the next element is dependent on whether you solved a certain puzzle or whether you talked with an NPC or not, which then unlocks new dialogue that needs to be measured. Okay, and so what ends up happening is that the game becomes very complex, very, very easily. And if you're not kind of organized with it, it can be very easy to make something that just becomes unmanageable. Okay, it's too big to it's too big really to kind of even wrap your own mind around it. After a few hours, you're like, okay, I need to simplify something here, because for one, it's not deterministic. I can't know for certain that my program is going to end just because you have a lot of unknowns in there. So, and you have a lot of state that can be independent, like dependent on each other. So especially if two variables if you're checking two variables, if they're true or false, for example, and if you never get to the spot where the one can be flipped, or if you change the one and you get some complex behavior that can show up if you're not careful. Okay, so then you come to the question. It's like, okay, I want to do a game competition. So how complicated is this going to be? Okay, how complicated? It's easy to get something that becomes a mess in a short amount of time. You'd be surprised. Okay, so one thing I like to do is suggest that you pick a few elements. Okay, you intentionally restrict the design so that it's almost impossible to mess that part up. Okay, for example, now it of course reduces the kinds of games you can make. Like, for example, let's just hypothetically say it was possible to make Civilization 5 in a weekend. Well, all of a sudden, just one set of direction keys is probably going to mess that whole. So forget about making Civ 5 in one weekend. But it was not realistic to start with, so it's okay. Okay, so it means that you probably couldn't make a game as rich as Civilization 5 just by restricting yourself to okay, I'm just going to use 4 directions and 1 action button and only 128 places in memory. So this is kind of a reference to the Atari 2600s. You had 128 bytes of memory. Your joysticks had 1 button, 4 directions. Okay, but I think there's a lot of interesting things you can do with just that set of restrictions. Okay, you just have to be a little bit more imaginative. But at the same time, you're not creating a bunch of complicated state that let's say you're doing a fighting game and you want to implement a whole bunch of combo moves where you have okay, move up, down, left, right, press the button 3 times, up, down, left, right again, and then you execute this special kung fu move, right? So you could maybe come up with a plan to do that, but if you all of a sudden had the entire joystick full of keys to be thinking about, then just the amount of code you're going to probably generate just doing the first iteration is going to be pretty huge. So I like to think, okay, for something that's going to take you an hour, a couple hours, or a weekend, you have to reduce the design to a certain degree that it becomes manageable. Okay, and that's all because the game state interrelates with each other. The game loop, when you're polling or handling events, becomes more complicated because you're allowing more things to happen. Okay, so when we talk about these game elements, it's okay. How can we know we have lots of things we could try, but the goal is to pick as few elements as you can. So make it simple, as simple as possible, but no simpler. Okay, so maybe we use the idea minimal viable game, okay, or minimal viable demo for that matter. You know, maybe you have a set of scenes you'd like to walk through, or a set of graphics techniques you'd like to walk through. Okay, so let's see here. Game concepts. So the only one I want to really focus on today was replayability. Okay, so how do you think we could add replayability? Like what are the things that makes games replayable?
In some way to increase, not necessarily increase, but some way to allow the players to express themselves. Like having a large pool of expression, I guess.
Okay, a large pool of
generation.
Okay, so you could randomly generate things that could happen. You could allow the player to express themselves in different ways. What do you think about that idea, expressing player expression? What are some ways that maybe modern games or allow players to express themselves that can help add to replayability?
For example, a recent game that came out, Devil May Cry 5, and this is like totally the opposite of having like one simple like action input. Let's see. The game has a combo system where depending on which input and in what order you do a combo in, it affects the strength of the attack and the animation that plays. And so what a lot of people really like about that game is the different ways that they can express or the different play styles that they can just convert from this really wild and variable system.
Okay.
Even though it's just controlling a single character and the end state is still I beat up a bunch of demons.
That sounds good. I know one area, it's kind of similar, some role-playing games you get to design your character up front. And you can kind of maybe specialize what their abilities are going to be. So maybe one is just kind of strong, is going to do a bunch of fighting, maybe takes a lot of damage, just a very strong character, but then, maybe not very smart and, or fast. And maybe they can't, try to get through a safe or pick a lock or something you might not expect a big burly guy to be able to find tooth little picks in a lock to kind of get through there, or even necessarily sit down and program a huge computer system to change something. You might have so just having, I guess, different offsets, or ways to start the game that can't be changed. That's one way of adding replayability. Or maybe you allow them to develop certain skills that gives them certain access to the game. Let's see here. What's another aspect of replayability? I think, how replayable is it? Can you give it a time? Is this game give you 5 minutes of enjoyment, 10 minutes of enjoyment? Maybe you play 10 games in 10 minutes, and you're like, that was fun for those 10 games, but I think I'm done. Right? How many people have played a game with a young child? It's a brand new game that came out, and you're like, looking forward to it. Unless it was what's wrong with Hi-Ho Cherry-O, or one of the Snakes and Ladders? What's wrong with those ones? They actually, those are kind of fun to play, but they're not like some games don't have very much like depth to them, and you're like, I don't feel like playing this. like Thomas and Train's Build a Track thing. It's like it's not my favorite ever.
There's the rewards aren't really, or I guess there isn't really that much of a reward for playing.
Right.
And even not necessarily like extrinsically, like I got like a lot more gold this time or a higher score, but there's no necessarily like reward for just playing the game in and of itself.
Right. Yeah, and that affects it. So there's like, okay, and how fun it is really kind of depends on replayability. You know, how much do you have that interaction with the player? You give them something to be like, I want to come back and watch it again. Same thing happens with movies too. You know, there are some movies you watch one time. There are some movies you hope you never have watched. And then there's some movies you're like, I could watch this movie over and over and over again. It does not bore me. You know, and everybody's different, right? I wouldn't necessarily expect your favorite movie to be your favorite movie or to be my favorite movie, but a lot of times, you know, so there's that measurement of like, okay, how much relevance did it have, you know, to each person, and then you know, some of these things can be. You can kind of measure replayability, or you can expect some dependency on playability to be related to how much effort you put into the game to start with. Okay, so for like a weekend game competition, I don't expect replayability to be high on the list unless you're really experienced with it. You get a feel for what people like and what people don't like, and you can kind of like use those in your designs as you go from design to design, and you're like, well, yeah, I remember trying that a while back, and that was a huge flop. I thought it was to be the biggest idea ever, and that was like, you know, boring. It's kind of like me designing all the homeworks for these classes. You're like, this is gonna be fun, and then it doesn't necessarily work out as, you know, as planned. But so replayability, you know, essentially, how much would you like to? Does a concept that you implement tend to want to be used over and over again? Okay, and the trick is if you can get that one concept to kind of, you know, that should be the main concept of the game. So if you kind of think of what would be fun to do over and over and over again, right? I always kind of laugh when I see Japanese RPG games because I kind of like the older ones. Were mostly return based, you know, but you're walking through a level, and then you're like, you know, it's almost, you walk for about 5 seconds, random battle, and depending on how interesting, sometimes you're in the mood for doing random battles, and then other ones you're just like, I'm just trying to get to the end, and especially when you're like 1 second away from getting to the door, and you're like, thing starts swirling, and you're like, oh, this is not what I wanted. And so the idea of their replayability, you know, how replayable it is. So thinking about your metric, and you know, going back to here, you know, you're trying to use a few elements so it doesn't get too complicated, but you're also trying to balance is how I guess what it lets you do is focus on one thing in particular that is kind of core to the idea. So I was going to show you two games that I did for two jams. One's called Manifold, this one has limited replayability, and the second one is Marco Polo, which I think has more replayability than the first one. This one was the theme for this game was Beneath the Surface, and in this case. A few things went right, a few things went wrong. We'll talk about those in just a second, but I figure I could show it to you. This is it. This is a game where it's like, okay, beneath the surface. So I kind of got inspired by this this Bible verse about people throwing idols to bats and moles, and so hopefully it's not too loud. So anyways, I thought this is kind of an interesting idea. Men just kind of like throwing idols at bats and moles. So I thought I'll make like a whack-a-mole type game, kind of based on this thing. And so I guess I like shooters, but the idea is that the bats kind of the moles, like they get to the bats, so you can whack them. And I tried to make the whacking thing kind of spectacular. So let's see if I can use a little bit of distance on the. Oh, I got stuck. That was one of the bugs in the game. You just have to die. Okay. There's that. Okay. Yeah, so this was what I was hoping to do is add bats to the game so that it would kind of get the whole picture in there. And then make the moles maybe do a... What happens is that the moles get... they get... there's just more of them that show up. Oh, there we go. So there's wave 2. And then sometimes you just, things you just don't expect, like if you start a brand new wave, and this happens a lot, just designing games like this, you don't think necessarily like, well, did I plan a pause? Like, we're starting the next thing of the game, because all this stuff happens so quickly right, in your computer. So then what this is one case, right? This is an element of random generation. We're just gonna play the end of this level. Okay. Sometimes they just die. Okay. Anyways, so it gets more and more complicated. So this was fun. There was a few things I always like to. I've always been impressed by this idea of a postmortem, which I saw in Gamma Sutra. I don't know. This was when I was in high school. Just kind of people talk about what went wrong in a project, what went right. So I'm like, yes, I like this. So I just like to talk about what went wrong. So when I did this game, I started with nothing. I've written graphics engines for a long time, so I was like, okay, I just didn't have the time to put in before all this happened. I just knew I was gonna do this jam no matter what. So I built the entire game and graphics engine from scratch. That takes time to do right. As you notice, we got stuck, right? And that's just a collision detection. Just one of those corner cases, right? Literally the corner, and because you can't just when you're testing, when you have 48 hours to think of the game and what you're doing, and you're trying to make graphics and sound and everything, it becomes hard to test things. It should just work right. And secondly, I hadn't made any games in years. I just knew I wanted to do it this one, and so what ended up going, I basically wasted so much time just trying to do all the technical stuff that I didn't have as much time to work on the fun stuff, which were the bats. I was hoping to do bats in there, and they would. But at least I got the moles. I was happy. I was kind of get them buried in the ground, and then they can pop up, and I thought that was fun. And things that went right. So I used the game library, just kind of loading graphics, sound. So I had some previous experience that kind of helped. It helps to work with things you're familiar with. I had already, because I was excited about this and I like making music, I'd already been practicing before the event happened. Like, okay, how am I going to sit down, write all the music for this, record it, and save it. So I already had some experience with that. And then I restricted the art to 8x8 sprites because 16x16 is like 256 pixels, 8x8 64. So right there, that reduces the amount of things you have to think about to very minimum. So those were things that I used to kind of help simplify the whole process. Use libraries you already know how to use, practice beforehand, and then just kind of restrict some of the choices you have so it's easier to deal with them. And then think of creative things you can do with it. Like, for example, when you hit the bat, I thought it'd be cool to have it fly up towards you and then back down again and kind of give like a 3D effect for it. So I think that worked out pretty good. So the second game I wanted to show you was Marco Polo, which is the one I did last year. And this one I had a lot of fun with. The theme for this was combine two incompatible genres, and so I thought immediately, I'll do. I've always wanted to do a text adventure game. Well, I got the idea for Marco Polo from this old basic text adventures book, and they had different things in there like a journey through the solar system, and Marco Polo, and Westward Ho, which is kind of where the game Oregon Trail kind of came out of, and then, or it was inspired by the game Oregon Trail. There was another one that I thought was interesting. It was about the Tour de France. I thought that's kind of interesting, text adventure game. But I always like Marco Polo because it's like you don't see very many Marco Polos out there, and I always been fascinated with the fact that he's like, I'm just gonna walk to China. Essentially. So I always wanted to kind of take this one and do something with it. So this one, let me see if I have it open. I think I have to go back. My terrible, I should make this into something worth looking at. So this is Marco Polo, and the idea here is I had this like adventure game. You kind of start out with a bunch of camels, and you have medicine, you have sacks of food, so all those are kind of interrelated. The camels eat the food. The health and medicine is useful if you get sick, which can happen. So anyways, I'm going to buy some camels. A lot of this stuff is like got random elements to it where, the cost could be a little bit variable. So we're going to keep journeying here. We're an acre. And the idea is after about 500 miles, hey, cool, acre's nice. I had random events just kind of show up. So kind of like random thoughts that just happen. You're like, oh, grass is green. I'm just imagining his like journal or something. It's like, acre's nice to visit. Okay, so we keep doing this. Like I said, random thoughts, just trying to add some humor to it. Text adventures can be a little bit boring because you're managing some stuff, but they're just not necessarily that great. Okay, so pretty soon here we go. Then it like switches to like side scroller shooter, and you're trying to protect these camels. And there's pirates and lions and tigers. Oops. Scorpions, yeah. Money. Oh. There's some bugs in how I'm doing that. I can get food. Whoa. For some reason, I'm having difficulty. Something happened. I gotta debug this. I think if I kill 5 more enemies, we'll switch back to adventure mode. Okay, come on. Okay, we made it. The camels, we lost a lot. So the camels we went from 25 camels to 12. Partially because my keyboard is kind of acting up, but so then I earned some money. Okay, I think if I buy medicine or food, that'll help increase the number, how much health I have. The medicine helps if you get sick too. So we should probably buy camels because we're not doing very well there. If you lose all your camels, you can't go nowhere. So some food was lost to camel spit. Lost a sack of food, and I have less than 1 sack left. Okay. I got sick with the flu. All right, I have 2 health points. So the health points is linked to the lives in the other one. So I have 4 health points left, and I just lost 3 camels. And 2 more. thieves came to steal your food, but you have none. They feel bad for you and give you a stolen sack from a rich man they robbed earlier. Silliness. That's just total silliness. And yeah, they just after a while, if you kind of added enough random stuff, then you want to see what'll happen that you haven't seen before. And then I did something interesting with the camels where they have so much strength, right? So basically they have health points, so they turn into skinny camels essentially if they're the rice is the food. Money. 7 enemies, okay. And you get so many missiles too, so you can earn missiles throughout the trip because you get more and more enemies as the game progresses. So anyways, it's fun. I had a lot of fun making this game. This is the most complicated game I think I've ever written. So we'll close that down. Okay, so what went right? Or we'll focus on what went right and we'll talk about what went wrong. So I had been practicing with the 1 hour game jam a number of times before, and those were a lot of fun. The earlier ones are terrible. Well, I think I like them, but like the lost button, this is the worst. This has nothing to do with anything. So you start the game and just random squares will skip the story. Oh, I try to come up with something. It's really hard to make a game in an hour. This is the first one I ever did, and it took me 3 hours. Okay. So the idea here is it's basically like Candyland, where you just roll the dice and you just keep going forward or backward. So there really isn't any like strategy. You just keep rolling the thing until and then random things could happen, like you lost money in the stock market, you have to go back, or you went too forward 2 steps. I think I have almost more fun making music for these things than I do, because that's what I have a lot of fun with. You got to go 6 steps ahead because you ate a healthy bowl of cereal. That was the people who tried the game really liked that really healthy bowl of cereal. All right, I got to the end. Yay, you found your button. Like I said, this thing on the top does nothing. But anyways, it was really challenging to make a game in 1 hour. And the first time you do it, you're like, whoa, this is you like really want to succeed. But I was able to get it done in time. They do like this streaming session after the 1 hour or about an hour and a half afterwards, and then they just kind of play through all the games that get made. So it's a good way to get other people to test your game and just kind of see if it works. So, all right, before I get lost in the music. Okay. So anyways, so I practiced with 1 hour game jam, and then I had some better tools to use. So I use this one tool called Pixel Edit for doing sprites and everything. And I used Ableton Live for doing music and sound effects. And I had basically been developing this JavaScript game library. And the one that we're using in the class, Libxor, is kind of like a descendant from those first steps in doing a JavaScript game engine. So things that went wrong, I had some state machines, but then to like do something where you have 2 games running at the same time, it was not going to nearly be good enough for doing that. So I basically have to revamp it. So anytime you waste, I'm going to call it wasting time in a game competition, making things that are not, like they're needed for your game, but they're not necessarily, it's something you could have done before that you could brought in later, right? So in other words, it's not going to be a top 10 finish because you spend all this extra time working on game mechanics. Hopefully, I feel like the best games are the ones that they've had practice. They've been developing something for a while, and then they're just like, okay, time to make the game part, and they just focus on the game. And then I didn't have a general AI framework, so enemies are boring. So as you noticed, they just kind of come at you. But I thought it'd be fun if they could be doing other interesting, like hide behind rocks, or try and give it a challenge, make them more interactive. And then the adventure game, I kind of built that from scratch, but that was kind of difficult to do because I hadn't made a text adventure game in a long time. So you're like trying to tweak. You spend a lot of time trying to tweak parameters like what are good values for this number? Like how many camels should you start out with, or how much should camels cost to buy versus food? Or so you spend a lot of time thinking about like weighting, getting good feel for what's going to be fun and what's not going to be fun. So building things from scratch is definitely hard to do well when you're kind of on the spot. So and it's sometimes just pure accident. Like you don't know what the theme is until like an hour before or the hour of, and then you're like, well, okay, how am I going to do this? So you're always kind of scratching your head. Where do I start? But anyway, so I knew I wanted to do Marco Polo. This was like perfect excuse. Like, okay, I'm going to do Marco Polo plus something else. So that was fun. Okay, so I thought it would be fun to had, I guess, just to design a game engine, right? Because we're going into this weekend, it's the last weekend, and you're probably thinking, how am I going to put something simple together? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and work on those kinds of elements, and we can work on whatever you think that you're hoping that you want to do. Okay. Now, the big thing for jams is you have to be flexible. So if you make something too rigid, then you're not going to like break out of it. In other words, like if you spend all your time planning to make Super Mario Brothers, then when you get a game like turn-based or some kind of concept that seems like diametrically opposed to what you picked as your like, this is the game I've basically been wanting to make forever, then you either like, well, I'll just wait to the next one, or you have to like start from scratch and retool things. So the flexibility thing is, if you're designing a game engine, you should plan for several possibilities to kind of come out of it. So there are some things you can definitely prepare for, like if you're doing a two-dimensional game, just having some things like collision detection, right, with 2D boxes. So you're not trying to solve that at the last minute. Is something you can do. Okay, and then the concept of like, what is the minimum viable game, and that can just be like, okay, let's just kind of prepare by having a start menu and a quit menu and a few of these things that can be done beforehand. Okay. I think I meant to put okay. So all right, so I'm going to stop streaming. We're going to do this exercise.